Street Fighter Alpha 3 is epic, and in my opinion one of the greatest and most polished Street Fighter experiences of all time. Sure, Street Fighter 6 is perhaps the most technically impressive Street Fighter ever, the Street Fighter 3 games have the greatest sprite work, and the 2 games are the most nostalgic. But it is Alpha 3 which contains the most insanely large roster of fighters out of any sprite-based Street Fighter games. This Capcom System 2-balled arcade game is beautiful, as were its ports to the Sega Saturn, Sony PlayStation and Sega Dreamcast, delivering a huge fighting game with a crazy amount of characters to choose from. As impressive as this was though, what is even more ridiculous is that not only would the game later be ported to the more humble GBA, but in some ways the title would even be built on, including the introduction of even more characters to the lineup. So with all of that said, join me today as we celebrate this gem, discuss its history, and look at everything this portable delight brought to the table. Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. This is the incredible Street Fighter Alpha 3 revision that, despite its high quality, killed the development studio. So what went so wrong for a company who created something that felt so right? Yeah. When Street Fighter 2 was being ported to home consoles, an agreement was reached that would have the iconic arcade fighter released exclusively on the Super Famicom. While later variations of Street Fighter 2 would go on multi-consoles, Nintendo would always hold a special place with the franchise for ushering in an era where Street Fighter Mania began at home. One of the last titles released for the console was an impressive port of Street Fighter Alpha 2, a surprise at the time as this was a game that would otherwise be exclusive to 32-bit CD consoles. While a bit limited on the aging hardware, it was an impressive feat, but this of course wouldn't be the last time the Alpha series found itself on a Nintendo console, but Nintendo fans would have to wait a couple of years first. As for the Street Fighter Alpha sub-series as a whole, it was definitely a shot in the arm for the aging Street Fighter franchise. With 5 mainline entries in the Street Fighter 2 series alone, a new iteration of the series was broached. Entitled Street Fighter Zero in Japan, the new series was placed chronologically between the original Street Fighter and the iconic Street Fighter 2, sometime after Ryu defeated Sagat, but before a certain psycho-powered dictator announced the second World Warrior tournament. Zero would redesign the cast in a very anime stylized design and would get ports to the CD based consoles of the day. Coming to English speaking countries carrying the name Alpha Warrior's Dreams, the game proved popular due to its revolutionised Capcom Super Bar system with a 3-tiered bar. Beyond bringing a number of characters back to the franchise after multiple year absences, characters like Charlie Nash, Dan and Rose would make their first appearances in the series, remaining popular regulars to this day. The game was a success and saw a sequel/revision Alpha 2, restoring more legacy characters from the original Street Fighter and its sequel. While Final Fight characters have been added to the franchise and Ryu would receive an evil iteration, the clear standout from this entry would be newcomer Sakura, the teenage Ryu fangirl who would become a megastar in Japan. A quick revision would update some moves and attacks known as 02 Alpha in Japan, but the franchise would soon reach its peak with Alpha 3 and its host of upgrades. In Alpha 3, the entire cast of Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo would be made available by the final home console version, and new cast members Karin, Juli and Rainbow Mika all proved to be standouts that continue to find themselves in many of the sequels. But when the title would come to handhelds, the definitive version would be released, and gamers would be chasing this highlight of the franchise since. While Nintendo had previous ports of the Street Fighter titles to the Game Boy, between a limited version of 2 for the original and a limited but quality version of Alpha for the Game Boy Color, 2001 saw the extremely impressive port of Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo created for the GBA. Amended as Revival, this port featured new stages, Shinakuma, and general remixing that would bring in many elements from Alpha. An impressive iteration, this looked to go beyond what the SNES could do, even if the GBA was largely considered a portable Super Nintendo at this point. But fortunately, this would not be the only GBA Street Fighter game that Capcom would have up their sleeve, because as shortly as just 1 year later, more Street Fighter goodness would arrive on the portable platform. 2002 would see the release of the simply titled Street Fighter Alpha 3 in Japan, Europe and North America, although the content included will be much closer to the upper enhanced port that had arrived previously on the home consoles. This fantastic effort was developed by Crawfish Interactive on behalf of Capcom, the same team who had previously worked on the original alpha port for the Game Boy Color. In an interview, Cameron Shepard, founder of Crawfish, and Mike Merrin, director of development, outline a great deal of information regarding the game's development, stating, "We developed Street Fighter Alpha on the Game Boy Color for Virgin, who were handling the license for the handheld format. I think they approached us after seeing Crawfish in the press all the time. We did a great job, which obviously went down well with Capcom. We produced some mocked up screenshots of what we thought we could achieve on the Game Boy Advance for Street Fighter Alpha 3, plus a few videos of a couple of characters fighting in front of a background. Capcom obviously liked what they saw and gave us the contract. It's a hugely successful game franchise, and our conversation had a release date coinciding with the Game Boy Advance's release date, which was right before Christmas 2001. The royalty deal was very good, coupled with a decent exchange rate at the time. 7 figures at least seemed very likely, plus the prestige of being responsible for what would have been the Game Boy Advance's star title for that Christmas. While optimistic for the substantial title to be done right, hurdles with Capcom would begin showing up. Mike Merrin adds that part of the agreement they had made was to try and get everything from the PlayStation version of the game and squeeze it into the GBA entry. But that's not all, as Capcom also requested to add 3 extra characters to the roster too. These would include Eagle from the original Street Fighter game, Maki from Final Fight 2, and Yun from Street Fighter 3, all of whom appeared redrawn in Capcom vs SNK 2 as well. He also mentions that when they started this process, they grossly estimated wrong how much space they would need on a cartridge, so therefore it became a ridiculously impressive coding feat, pulling off and managing to fit all of the content within the game. Positively, they added that Capcom were very hands-off with the development process, within the early phases the Japanese company placing all their trust in the hands of the British team working at Crawfish. But this would all change with the extensive bug testing process, which would require Crawfish to go over the fine details with their game over and over again. To make this task all the more complex, all feedback was in Japanese, so the Brits would need to get the instructions translated first. Merrin adds, "It was a tough process at the end that extended things even further. We probably took 3 times longer from the beta stage to completion than we did on any of the other projects we did. Looking back, I think we gave Capcom too much respect and didn't push back on areas of the development that we should have. These problems would eventually lead to the title being delayed past the ideal Christmas 2001 window." Crawfish founder Cameron Shepard adds that they had been entrusted with one of Capcom's most prestigious titles, and they were under a huge amount of pressure, and not only had they been tasked with making the best version of the game, for the Game Boy Advance of all bloody things, but they also had a deadline of Christmas 2001. Shepard was extremely frustrated during the undertaking of this tall task, and not just due to the development challenge itself, but also because he had personal guarantees in place with the bank with regards to Crawfish's debt, which was spiralling out of control for other reasons. With a harsh amount of beta testing, combined with having to constantly translate orders from Japanese, the team would fail to reach their 2001 Christmas deadline. This meant Capcom would come down hard on the Brits, including cancelling certain royalties due to the development delay. Shepard frustratedly adds that losing the final payments from the advance, plus the royalties, was a deep blow at a bad time. Crawfish was in a delicate position due to a lull in signing new titles, which can happen after new hardware is announced. In this case, it was the Game Boy Advance. Publishers can drop support for the existing hardware when new hardware is announced, and delay signing titles for the new hardware until they are sure that the new hardware could be successful. If it was completed and released in time for Christmas, the Game Boy Advance is first, with a limited number of other titles vying for the shopper's cash, we would have reaped considerable royalties, solidifying Crawfish's financials for the foreseeable future. We would also have received much attention and would have had tons more work offered to us by not just Capcom themselves, but other publishers as well. What made this missed deadline all the more irritating for Crawfish is that the former team notes that if they had managed to hit it, they may have even became a target of a corporate buyout, which would have been lovely for them financially. Shepard regretfully adds, if we had pulled it off, it would have been fantastic for Crawfish, and we would have been propelled onwards and upwards towards something brilliant. So Street Fighter Alpha 3 didn't take us down per se, but it failed to not only save us but also make us huge in some way. I certainly don't regret taking the job on. If I have any regrets, they would be to do with my decisions I made at the time, just over 12 years ago. Margins were very tight as publishers were squeezing budgets hard on Game Boy Advance titles, and a 1 month slip on some of the smaller ones meant the profit was gone. Working on so many titles at a time spread us thinly, and slippage became inevitable. We were a small Croydon handheld developer punching well above its weight, with global publishers wanting us to work on their titles. It was hard to turn a title down. In many ways, we were a casualty of our own success. Crawfish Interactive would go defunct soon after the release of Street Fighter Alpha 3 for the Game Boy Advance, with their last two titles, Superman Countdown to Apocalypse and Ed, and Eddie, Jawbreakers, having started production but being finished up elsewhere. If game quality would equal profitability though, Street Fighter Alpha 3 would be a goldmine. Reviews at the time were glowing, with IGN giving the game an amazing 9 out of 10, particularly highlighting the single player experience where most people would be coming to the title for multiplayer action. They heavily praise including the unlockables, gushing that the development team encouraged fighting the computer AI by locking away characters and hidden gameplay modes that are only revealed as players finish the game with a specific character. To put the scale of this game into perspective, it would include more than 30 playable characters, 3 who are all exclusive to this version, custom controls tailored to the GPA, multiple unlockable modes, link cable support and more, all on a humble GBA cartridge. Now you were playing with power. A lack of Nintendo power, but a very impressive port considering the limitations. IGN would highlight that Crawfish Entertainment had sadly shut their doors a few weeks before the game had even been released, which seemed tragic considering how good this effort was. They would comment that the team meticulously recreated the same gameplay experience of the arcade and Dreamcast versions of Street Fighter Alpha 3, and even though purists will note some cosmetic alterations in the conversion, the development team succeeded in its task. Street Fighter Alpha 3 for the most part looks, sounds and plays like the game that's considered one of Capcom's finest 2D fighting designs. They would conclude their review with, Street Fighter Alpha 3 is definitely one of the best fighters on the Game Boy Advance to date, and shouldn't be missed if you're a GBA owner that has the taste for the successful Street Fighter action. Retrospectively, it almost feels criminal that such a great game would contribute to dooming the development house behind this amazing little handheld offering. Still, the portable Street Fighter Alpha 3 story didn't quite end with Crawfish, as another portable version would see release for the PlayStation Portable in 2006. Known as Street Fighter Alpha 3 Max, the Max iteration of the title was released on much more powerful hardware, so development of such a game was nowhere near as impressive an undertaking as what had been pulled off on the GBA prior. It did however add Ingrid though from Capcom Fighting Evolution to the mix. If you'd like to hear more about this penultimate version of the game, let me know in the comments, maybe we could rustle something up. As for the GBA iteration, while this would be the last time a custom Street Fighter Alpha port would be made for a Nintendo console, the early days of the Nintendo 3DS would see an impressive port of Super Street Fighter 4 for the 3-dimensional handheld, and Ryu and Ken would eventually join the lineup of Super Smash Bros., appearing on the franchise's Wii U and 3DS iterations. Building on this tale, Ultra Street Fighter 2 would be an early release for the Switch, adding Violent Ken and Evil Ryu to the roster. So while Nintendo might not be the first in line for fighting games, they eventually do find their way to the console. Are we expecting Street Fighter 6 Max Remix for the Switch 2 for Christmas 2024? Only time will tell. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, check out my upload on Capcom vs SNK 2. It was made the same year. Yeah.